Path. This is the path from the root directory of the server in the desired resource. In this case, you can see that there is a directory is called dir. Keep in mind that in relative web servers may use aliasing to point to documents, gateways, and the services that are not explicitly accessible from the server's root directory. Path segment params. This is the portion of URL that includes optional name value pairs that is path segment parameters. A path segment parameter is typically preceded by a semicolon, depending on the programming language used, and it comes immediately after the path information. In this example, the path segment parameter is ID 89, or here ID 89. Path segment parameters are not commonly used. In addition, it's worth mentioning that these parameters are different from query string parameters, often referred to as URL parameters. Query string. This is optional portion of the URL, contains name value pairs that represent dynamic parameters associated with the request. These parameters are commonly included in links for tracking and the context setting purposes. They may also be produced from variables in HTML formats. Typically, the query string is preceded by a question mark equals sign like this. Separate names and the values and the ampersands mark the boundaries between name value pairs. In this example, the query string is this one. In addition, other protocols such as HTML and CSS are used on things like Simple Object Access Protocol and the RESTful APIs. Examples include JSON, XML, and the web processing services, which is not the same with the VPS in wireless networks. A REST API is a type of application programming interface, or in a short API, that conforms to the specification of the representational state transfer, or REST architectural style, and allows for interaction with web services. REST APIs are used to build and integrate multiple application software. In short, if you want to interact with a web service to retrieve information or add, delete, or modify data, an API helps you communicate with such a system in order to fulfill the request. REST APIs use JSON as the standard format for output and the requests. SOAP is an older technology used in legacy APIs that uses XML instead of JSON. Extensible markup language remote procedure call XML RPC is a protocol in legacy applications that uses XML to encode its calls and leverage HTTP as a transport mechanism. Okay, let's talk about the web sessions. The web session is a sequence of HTTP requests and the response transactions between a web client and a server. These transactions include pre-authentication tasks, the authentication processes, session management, access control, and the session finalization. Numerous web applications keep track of information about each user for the duration of a web transaction. Several web applications have the ability to establish variables such as access rights and localization settings. These variables apply to each and every interaction a user has with the web application for the duration of the session. Web applications can create sessions to keep track of anonymous users after the very fast first user request. For example, an application can remember the user language preference with every time it visits the site or application frontend. In addition, a web application uses a session after the user has authenticated. This allows the application to identify the user on any subsequent requests and be able to apply security access controls and increase the usability of the application. In short, web application can provide session capabilities both before and after authentication. After an authentication session has been established, the session ID or token is temporarily equivalent to the strongest authentication method used by the application, such as usernames and the passwords, on-time passwords, and the client-based digital certificates. In order to keep the authenticated state and the track user progress, applications provide users with session IDs or tokens. A token is assigned at session creation time, and it's shared and exchanged by the user and the user web application for the duration of the session. The session is a name-value pair. The session ID names used by the most common web application development frameworks can be easily fingerprinted. For instance, you can easily fingerprint PHP SSID, GSS session ID, CFID, or CF token. And many others. In addition, the session ID name may indicate what framework and the programming languages are used by the web application. It's recommended to change the default session ID name and the web development framework to a generic name such as ID. The session ID must be long enough to prevent brute force attacks. Sometimes developers set it to just a few bits, so it must be at least 128 bits or 16 bytes. Note that it's very important that the session ID be unique and unpredictable. You should use a good deterministic random bit generator to create a session ID value that provides at least 256 bits of entropy. There are multiple mechanisms available in HTTP to maintain session state within web applications, including cookies, the URL parameters, and the rewriting defined RFC 3986 and the URL arguments on GET requests. In addition, developers use body arguments on POST requests, such as hidden form fields or priority HTTP headers. However, one of the most widely used session ID exchange mechanisms is cookies, which offer advanced capabilities not available in other methods. Including the session ID in the URL can lead the manipulation of the ID or session fiction attacks. It's therefore important to keep the session ID out of the URL. This might seem pretty obvious, but you have to remember to encrypt an entire web session, not only for the authentication processes where the user credentials are exchanged, but also to ensure that the session ID is exchanged only through an encrypted channel. The use of an encrypted communication channel also protects the session against some session fiction attacks in which the attacker is able to intercept and manipulate the web traffic to inject the session ID on the victim's web browser. Session management mechanisms based on cookies can make use of two types of cookies: non-persistent or session cookies and the persistent cookies. If a cookie has a max age or expires attribute, it's considered a persistent cookie and is stored on a disk by the web browser until the expiration time. Common web applications and the clients prioritize the max age attribute over the expired attribute. Modern applications typically track users after authentication by using non-persistent cookies. This forces the session information to be deleted from the client if the current web browser instance is closed. This is why it's important to be non-persistent cookies, so the session ID does not remain on the web client cache for long periods of time. Session IDs must be carefully validated and verified by an application. Depending on the session management mechanisms that is used, the session ID will be received in a get or post parameter in the URL or in an HTTP header using cookies. If web applications do not validate and filter out invalid session values, they can potentially be used to exploit other vulnerabilities such as SQL injection if the session IDs are stored on a relation database, or persistence cross-site scripting if the session IDs are stored and reflected